Hi, my name is Nathan Hobson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bergen, Norway, and the founder and organizer of the Japan Roundtable podcast. This third episode presents a wide ranging discussion of issues around sports in Japan and Japanese sports in the world. Consultant and sports researcher Aaron Miller moderates a panel with Professor Robin Kitlinski of LaGuardia Community College and Professor Dennis Frost of Kalamazoo College. By exploring themes from nationalism and identity to the cultural meanings of celebrity and disability, their discussion offers a dynamic look at how sports reflect and shape Japanese society. ジャパンラウンドテーブルをお聞きいただきありがとうございます。私はノルウェー国立ベルゲン大学准教授のホブソンと申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。さて、今回日本におけるスポーツと世界における日本のスポーツに関する問題を幅広く議論していただきます。コンサルタント兼スポーツ研究者のアーロン・ミラー氏がホストを務め、ラガルディアコミュニティカレッジのロビン・ケトリンスキ教授と、カラマズーカレッジのデニス・フロスト教授の2名のパネリストを迎えます。ナショナリズムとアイデンティティから有名人と障害スポーツの文化的意義まで様々なテーマを探求することにより、今回はスポーツが日本社会をどのように反映し、どのように形成するかについて意見を交わします。
Like the biggest sports stuff in Japan right now is Otani. I mean that's undoubtedly like kind of the biggest thing right now that I'm seeing in the news and anywhere. And I think that's also true in the US. I mean, I teach this class every other year on sports in East Asia, and it's just students have to do a research paper, and I have like three, maybe four students who are doing something on Otani
Wow.
in the class out of 20. So, so it's like it's a different world in terms of baseball, I think. Ichiro was kind of one level, and then Otani is this whole other level. Winning a World Series, winning all these awards, and I think that's been the thing that I'm seeing the most in the like Japan related media in the United States. But there's also a lot like the Japanese media coverage about him. So it's kind of interesting. And then there's a little bit about the Deaf Olympics are happening, I think, in Tokyo. I'm not sure the date on those. I should probably have looked that up, but I think it's this summer, and I'm not sure exactly when. But I've had a little bit of buzz about that, but nothing like what I was seeing for the Olympics and Paralympic coverage. So that's one of those recurring things.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on the Otani stuff. I mean, the students that I'm teaching are all fascinated by him, and I think, this is where I think our conversation could get kind of interesting, from my perspective at least. For me, Otani is this kind of human validation of all these years of effort that Japanese people generally have been putting into baseball. Because Ichiro was great, of course. I remember reading people say, "Oh, there'll never be a position player in baseball. There'll be pitchers, because that's a different skill set and whatever." But people said, there'll never be a position player that's successful that comes from Japan. Then Ichiro blew that out of the water. And then they said, well, there'll never be a power hitter. And then Hideki Matsui came and he blew that out of the water. But now you got this guy who can do all those things. He can run like Ichiro. He can hit like Matsui. He can hit better, actually, than Matsui. And he's an MVP and he can pitch. I mean, he's the first person to do it since Babe Ruth. It's crazy. It's crazy how good he is. And so I think for a lot of kids, he's this validation of just that ability to just work hard at stuff over time and win. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's the story I'm telling myself about it, and that's why I feel like it maybe is interesting. Are you guys hearing that from students who are writing papers about it, or what do you make of that idea?
I mean, I'm not teaching this year, nor do I teach a class specifically on sports. But like I do think that I think that there's something like I remember writing. I'm not a baseball expert by any means. In fact, my book was almost like a anti-baseball book. But I wrote something in like, I don't remember if it was a foreword or an afterword of my book about women's baseball. It was like, oh yeah, because the subtitle of the book is Beyond Baseball and Sumo, which are two like
Yeah.
all male national sports of Japan. And it said, what about women's baseball and women's sumo? And women's sumo isn't really practiced widely in Japan, but it is like in Eastern Europe. But I remember reading about this really interesting female baseball player who was one of the very few women who was recruited to play minor league baseball in the U.S., like on a men's team. And her name is escaping me right now. But like, I thought it was so interesting, not so much for like the baseball stats. I think she was very good, but she was like a, what do you call it, knuckleballer. But I thought the fact that like it was the Chico State somewhere in California. I don't know the name of their minor league team.
Oh, okay. I think you might know
But
who you're
like
talking-
she filled the stands with Japanese fans and specifically Japanese women. And like she wasn't that good. The team didn't do that well, but it made me think a lot about sort of like, you know, ticket sales and like what are these events for beyond just the sheer like wins and losses. It's about a lot more, and that's kind of reminding me of this Ohtani conversation. Although like what Aaron's talking about is just really the athleticism. But I do think there's more of this, I don't know if it's soft diplomacy or something like that. I just thought it was fascinating. What's that?
I think they're related. I mean, I think like you can't get to the level of Ohtani unless you are just maniacal about your training, right? You just can't. Like no one becomes a Major League Baseball player unless they're crazy about their training. And why people are crazy about their training is obviously an answer with many questions, or with many a question with many answers. Serves me right for planning this on a Friday afternoon, right? But I think you know nationalism is a huge part of that, right? That's obviously you know been a big theme in the writing I've done on Japanese sports, and I just think for Ohtani and Ichiro and Matsui, I mean they may not have come out publicly and said you know I'm an ultra right-wing nationalist, but you know there's this desire in Japan, particularly in baseball, to beat Americans at their own game. And sometimes it's mentioned explicitly, sometimes it's more implicit. But I think that's there. That's just my sense of it. I obviously can't prove that on any sort of scientific level, you know, but
I think it's more pronounced in baseball because it's like an American sport than any other international sporting event.
And it's a power and performance sport. You know, Jay Coakley, this very well-known sports sociologist, he's got this distinction between power and performance sports and then everything else. And I think Coakley's right about that. Like some sports are created and were created specifically during the, you know, age of imperialism. And they're really football, basketball, baseball, these sports that are traditionally excluding women. They are sports where, you know, nationalism, I think, is stronger, has a stronger influence. That's my opinion, you know.
Yeah, I think and I think there is a like a gendered element to it as well, in the sense, and I'm thinking in particular about like I am teaching this class here, and we actually read articles by both of you at various points in the class. I tell the students, I'm like, yeah, almost everybody we're reading, I know them personally. So it's always an interesting moment. But I was thinking about the article you wrote about the Foucauldian power in Japan, and this idea of kind of like the Japanese body has been seen as inferior, and so we have to overcome this through this kind of extreme emphasis on training to the extent of overwork. And I think, you know, especially in terms of sports stars, some of my earlier work, and you know, like you, Robin, like you were saying earlier, like having to go back and kind of really look at that stuff again because it's been, you know, a couple of decades in some ways since we were really working actively on those kinds of things. But looking back at some of that, you know, one of the things that I noticed is that there's been, and I think part of it goes back to your point about the different types of sports, right? But there's been kind of an up and down in terms of how Japan has been perceived in the international realm of sports. And so one of my questions when I think about Ohtani is like, we're clearly on an upward swing. right?
Mhm.
Japan like has like been really good. Their soccer teams have been pretty decent and competitive, both men's and women's. But then, so I think we're on an upward swing. So like, is there going to be a downward swing? Because it seems like there's kind of been all these moments where it's been up and down. But the other piece of this is that there's been lots of moments where, the women's teams have been better or the female athletes have been better. And I think that this is something that, both Robin and I worked and wrote about Hitomi Kinoe. Um,
Yes.
and she was like this exceptional athlete at the international level from Japan. But she was a woman. And so like there's an element like, oh, well, what's wrong with our men that they can't compete at this international level at the same level that these women are. And so I think there's a really interesting potential gender element here as well, that we could maybe spend some time unpacking. But yeah, that's just something that occurred to me as we were chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Robin, what do you think?
Oh, I could spend an hour talking about Hitomi
Go
Kinoe,
for it. Tell,
but I
tell it. I
won't.
mean,
No,
I'm
I
guessing that
won't.
the people listening want to hear it, so go for it.
But well, I don't know if the people listening know who she is. But yeah, she was the first Japanese female Japanese Olympian and medalist. And as somebody who ran track in college, like I did the cross country and the 800 and 1600. These are like distance events on track. But he told me it was a sprinter, and trained as a sprinter, and was very good and had won some other international, like national and international competitions before going to the 1928 Olympics in Amsterdam. And she went, and that was also the first Olympics that had track at all, because this was kind of like, to your earlier point, Aaron, like, I guess this is a performance sport. I don't know, is it power or performance running?
I mean, yeah, I think Coakley would say it's power and performance,
Okay.
because it's about, yeah, strength and power and how you perform in front of others, right? Sort of made for spectators as opposed to participatory sports like hacky sack or ultimate frisbee, those kinds.
Okay, so yes, definitely power and performance. But so she took part in the first ever, track events for women, and did not actually medal in what she was, expected to, which I think was the 100-meter. Like, she got to the finals and then she took fourth place or something and didn't get a medal. And sort of at the last moment, which you obviously can't do in the Olympics anymore, she like registered for a separate event that she had not trained for, which was the 800-meter. And I mean, I just think that's crazy that she had not specifically trained for this event and then went on to win a silver medal. And so just from like a sort of training standpoint, I think that's really fascinating. And I do think that like nationalism just trumps like gender, especially in that era, I would say, which was 1920s Japan, military expansion, etc. If you hear the national anthem and see the flag, I don't think it really matters. And I think there is also a sociologist who talks about these solidarity moments in terms of race, right? In this country, it's like it doesn't matter the race of the athlete on the court or on the field, whereas racism can still exist in real life. I think it's really similar with gender, right? Like, it does not mean that women were warmly embraced in all arenas in Japanese society, but I don't think when it came to winning medals at international events that gender mattered. And I think there's other much more nuanced points to it, like when you were talking about women being better, I immediately thought about the Women's World Cup,
yeah,
and the women's soccer team, but how they like still wasn't it them who like couldn't fly first class and the men were?
Yep.
So like stuff like that still exists. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's I was curious to pick your brain about that too, Robin, like seeing, what continuities are there in sort of gender politics over time, and what, discontinuities, or, what's changed. I mean, that's something that I've always been fascinated in, but of course both of you have the historical bona fides to actually know the answers to these questions. I don't. So I, use your sources and secondary sources, what are secondary to me, to do my writing. But yeah, I mean, what's different now? Anything? Is it, you mentioned that, back in the 20s, nationalism trumping gender. It's always seemed to me like those kind of gender politics end at the water's edge, because sports are this huge nationalistic vehicle. But um, but yeah, maybe I'm wrong about that. What do you think?
Well, as I mentioned, I started doing gender research like now that's ancient history a couple decades ago. But then I revisited it, and I don't actually remember what the article was, but like I wrote something about gender for the most recent Olympics. Um, and I found it striking. It's like the just the women in positions of power were kind of striking. It was like the governor of Tokyo. There were a number of like senior Olympic officials who were women, which is like kind of unusual in the sports world anyway. Um, and then in the opening ceremonies, it was like all women. It like started with women. The final torchbearer was Naomi Osaka, who maybe like Dennis could say more about because that's other, kind of marginalized groups having like a very important place at the table. But I also think it's like what Dennis said earlier about like ups and downs. I think also with different sports, it's hard to draw sort of like overarching narratives, I think. Because even when I started, what initially like got me interested and that I wrote my first like grad student paper about sports and gender was actually probably around 2004. I was in grad school and a Japanese woman had won the Olympic marathon for a second time. So there was like, a Japanese woman won in 2000, and then another Japanese woman won the marathon, which is a sport that traditionally, and again today, is almost always dominated by East African women. So for a grad school paper, I was trying to figure out, like, why are these Japanese women so good at running the marathon? And I did a really deep dive, and that's how I started connecting with like the sports scholars of Japan, world, both in Japan and in the U.S. And that's where I was encouraged to write about women in sports because there wasn't really much historical context or anything written, especially in English. And so I did this really deep dive and like a ton of research about long distance running. And then like they really haven't done too well in the marathon since 2004. So for over 20 years, they're fine, but like they are rarely in the like, top 10 anymore. So were those two like flukes? I did think they had the same coach, like maybe they just had like a really good coach and two really good athletes. Maybe the East Africans like got even better in their training or strategy. I don't know. But I do find it hard. And same with soccer. Like I thought that might be something, but that seemed like they're still pretty good. The women's soccer team is pretty good.
I wonder if there's some investment that's happening or not happening, because I think, one of the things that you've seen with sports like baseball in Japan is the investment is there because almost every school has a team. And so it's just ultimately kind of a numbers game in the sense that you're going to produce great players when you have that many kids playing a sport. And the central government is funding the schools and the fields, and these kids are playing. And so whereas, with a sport like the marathon, I suspect there's much less investment. I mean, when I was researching basketball in Japan, this, very minor sport, I was sort of surprised to just find that so many people take it so seriously because, Japan has produced professional players, but not many. And more on the women's side, and earlier on the women's side, successful professional players. But the men hadn't really been that successful. So I was just sort of fascinated at how much investment, how much money, how many people that I met that were just like so serious about it. And it's such a big sport at the school level. And that sort of explained it to me a little bit because they were passionate about the sport at the school level, but then they sort of lost interest because it had never materialized as a professional sport domestically. And there were pockets of people who were big NBA fans, but again, without the equivalent of a Shohei Ohtani, in the NBA, they never really had the.
There, Hachimura.
Well, so yeah, so Hachimura is this interesting case though because
Mhm.
he's half Japanese and half Beninese, and so some people sort of take him as a native son, and others don't. And I
Mhm.
think, that's part of what the book is about how the first guy to really kind of break through was Tabuse or the early 2000s, and he, basically had a cup of coffee in the NBA, played just a few games. That's the old joke about playing in professional baseball, right? He had a cup of coffee in the majors, but but anyway, but he made it, and when he came back to Japan, I saw him practice, and I saw all the other Japanese kids watch him practice, and I mean, they might as well have been watching Michael Jordan play basketball. I mean, this was a guy who had touched an NBA court with his feet, and he was just absolutely mesmerizing to these, college players. So he sort of started that process, and then of course, later, Hachimura would break through, and he is a very successful NBA player. And I think Japan should take credit. I mean, my own opinion here. I think Japan should take credit for Hachimura. I mean, he
Did he grow
was
up in Japan?
yeah, he grew up in Japan. He played in Japan. I mean,
Mhm.
he's a great player, but again, because of these questions of what makes you fully Japanese,
Mhm.
which I know you both have looked at extensively as well. Pretty much anybody who does Japanese research, Japan research, looks at these questions. I think, most people in the public haven't really said he's our guy. And so there was this other guy named Yuta Watanabe, and he was sort of seen as like forgive the expression, but the great white hope, right? That he would be the guy who would validate um, a Japanese, in the very ethnic sense, approach to
Mhm.
basketball um, that wasn't reliant on Beninese genes. You know what I mean? So I got a whole chapter in the book just called DNA because of
Mhm.
all these debates about, who gets to be called Japanese, who doesn't. And it got me
Mhm.
really thinking in a way about these topics of, sport, race, ethnicity. I've been teaching about that for years, but I hadn't really thought about it in as much depth as I started to think about it, having, written that chapter. So
Yeah, did you write, Dennis, did I see somewhere that you wrote about Naomi Osaka?
I have not. I mean, I've
Oh.
talked about her I talk about her in class, and like, but I mean, I think there's an interesting group of athletes right now, particularly in the United States or internationally active. You've got Yu Darvish, you've got
yeah,
Hachimura, you've got Naomi Osaka. These athletes who have these kind of different backgrounds. They have one parent from Japan, one parent from somewhere else, and they become these superstars, and they get embraced by Japan. Um, but it reminds me a little bit. I mean, I wrote about Okinawa, which and Gushiken Yoko, the boxer from Okinawa, really popular in Japan in the late 70s, early 80s. Um, and one of the things I talked about with Gushiken was this idea that they were embracing Gushiken because he was winning at this international level, and he was the Japanese superstar, and he was also the Okinawans were seeing him as the Okinawan superstar. Um, and like there was some potential for tension there, but it never manifested because Gushiken never actually had to play or box with a Japanese boxer. He always boxed international boxers. So you never had this moment where Gushiken, the Okinawan boxer, was fighting a Japanese boxer. So
was
he
that
could always.
intentional? Sorry to interrupt, but was that
Yeah, no,
intentional?
I don't know. Like, I mean, I did a little like digging into that kind of stuff, but boxing promotion was something that I didn't go down that rabbit hole all the way. I mean,
Mhm.
there was a potential moment where there was a champion that he could have potentially boxed, that would have, been a decent boxing match probably. So part of my sense is that promotionally this was deemed kind of a bad idea. That's my guess, right? That this was not something they wanted to do. Um, but but I think that idea of like him being embraced, there was no tension there in the sense that like he could be Japanese and Okinawa at the same time because nobody ever had to choose. Um, and I think that ultimately kind of what happened there is that you got this sense. I call it spectacular difference is what I how I described it in the book. That people were kind of celebrating his Okinawanness, but in this way that was kind of like oh, look, he's different. He's not a baseball player, to your point, Robin. He's not a baseball player from Tokyo in particular. This is the era like the V9 Giants and all that. So he's this celebrity who's a little bit different and he does these things different and he talks kind of funny. Isn't that interesting? But it was this embrace of him and the difference, but it was never an actual embrace of kind of trying to understand what the difference was. And why Okinawa was different and how it was kind of its history. And you didn't have to do that and this kind of your point about kind of some of these tensions and issues disappearing at the water's edge. I think there's something to that, right? That sports is like, oh, well, yeah.
Sorry.
So,
I just have a follow-up
go ahead.
question. Have either of you researched like sumo wrestlers? Because I think a lot of them are foreign.
Yes. Yeah. I haven't
Including
done
some
I haven't done
Yokozuna,
research on that, but yeah, that's been a big thing that I've read about in the sports media about how, some of these sumo wrestlers come from Mongolia or Eastern
Russia.
Europe and they get to be Yokozuna and there's this big, thinking like, well, why aren't Japanese people becoming Yokozuna, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I every time I'm in Japan in the summer, I take my kids to see sumo, and this was the first time where I logged on. I had put on my calendar get sumo tickets, and they were like immediately sold out
Wow.
for every single day of the tournament for like 14 days.
I believe that actually because the exchange rate is still pretty good.
I know it's just over tourism, but this has never happened to me. I was like going to go to Nagoya and not able to get tickets anymore.
Yeah. No, I think that there was a lot of debate. I think, around 2017, I think when I was there doing the research for the last book, that was, that was the first time there'd been a Japanese Yokozuna like in quite a while. And he was promoted and then he got injured like in the very next tournament. And then so he never really, I think we saw him wrestle when we were there. And then that was really one of the last times he wrestled. Like it was like later that week, he ended up dropping out of that tournament. And so there was, there was this big celebration and the crowds went up as a result of that. And then after he kind of ended up like retiring, then it was kind of like, well, when are we going to get our next Japanese Yokozuna? So I haven't followed it as closely in recent years. I feel like that's a sport. It is possible to follow internationally, but it's way easier to do when you're in Japan and you could just turn on the TV and it's on.
I think there were also a couple of international wrestlers who got in trouble for drugs. Like there were some Russians who were using marijuana, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I'm also curious. I mean, part of me thinks this is exactly why baseball is so popular in Japan. I've been fascinated by this question of, okay, what makes it a major sport? What makes it a minor sport, right? Because every time I would go talk to anybody about basketball in Japan, they would say, oh, that's a minor sport. And I kept thinking, and I've had this similar question in America when I talk to people about the notion of being big time in college sports, right? Because my second book wasn't about Japan; it was about basketball in America, and all these people say, well, will women's basketball in America ever become big time? And this was before Caitlin Clark and all that. So a lot of people would probably say, well, yeah, it is big time now. But back in those days, there was this like constant media narrative about is women's sports big time, and it was just like fueling itself, But in Japan, what's major, what's minor? There's this concept of frozen space that these scholars, I'm forgetting their names, but they have this concept like once there's a sport that's sort of so popular and so strong in a country, then it creates this space that's frozen and no other sport can kind of get in there and become popular. And it just makes sense to me, that theory, because I just feel like that's baseball. And I wonder if part of the reason why it's baseball, again, beating Americans at their own game, but also because sumo is not being won by Japanese wrestlers anymore. And that's the national sport, right? So I don't know. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I mean, I think baseball and sumo have a really complicated history going back to like, really like I think the 1800s, late 1800s, where baseball really starts to take off. And you have, I just read the article, Roden's article on Ichiko, just actually for today's discussion in my class. And so I think like baseball kind of rises in the 1890s. And sumo, which is struggled actually, is kind of having a kind of reemergence right around that same time, and they're kind of operating by pitting themselves against each other to a certain extent. I mean, you don't have the baseball players talking about sumo, but you have the baseball players claiming that like they're doing a martial arts type thing, like they're doing the Bushido baseball idea, right? And this is right at the same moment where you have sumo starting to be talked about as like the national sport, um, in contrast to this new emerging sport, which is increasingly popular with young people. And then there's an idea of sumo do emerges, right? That, well, we're doing a martial art too. And there's a way of sumo, just like there is a way of baseball. And so I think that there has been this kind of tension between the two of those. But in some ways, I think to your point that you're talking about, Aaron, like I think that they suck the air out of the room. In a manner of speaking, it's frozen. Like there's no room left for any other kind of sports to kind of get into that kind of discussion. I think of rugby in particular, and soccer. Both have tried these big, huge international events, and what I've seen is like, yes, they kind of generate stuff. Like there's more interest in soccer than there was like when I first started going to Japan, where I never saw anybody playing soccer, and now you do. But then like rugby is kind of in the same category, right? That they've had these big World Cups in Japan, and it generated a little bit of buzz, and then there's still some attention, but it's it kind of disappears pretty quick. So it's
There's something.
yeah.
I think there's some. Sorry, I cut you off, but there's like something class based that I was like brought to my attention about rugby as well, and like what actually I said I've moved past this project, but like one of the things that I was thinking about with the environment and sports projects was like, do you know the Meiji Shrines, like Inner Garden? That's where the Olympic Stadium is, and there's this huge redevelopment project, which I don't know how familiar you are, but like basically, you've got these baseball fans like wrapping their arms around the Meiji State, like the stadium where the Swallows play, because that's what is it, like one of the only remaining stadiums where Babe Ruth ever played, and it's this old historic stadium, even though it is like pretty old. So people want to protect that, but a bunch of politicians, including some very prominent ones, they want to build this like massive new rugby thing, and there actually is already a rugby facility there, but they like the impetus for this project is largely to create like a bigger rugby stadium. And like, yeah, Dennis is right. It's not like a hugely popular sport, but someone was telling me that it's like these politicians with a lot of influence who are just really into rugby from their college days or something, and so they're the ones who keep pushing these projects, even though the public is increasingly opposed to them. And I think especially with like, there was a big campaign about how many trees were going to get cut down.
Yes, that was Rochelle Kopp. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I spoke with her, and she started this huge petition. And I mean, I think the project was modified ultimately. I still think something is moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't followed up with Rochelle on that, but I know she was instrumental in getting a lot of 100,000 signatures on a petition or something like that.
Yeah, it was very controversial, but I guess my point, and like I've also thought about this, like why did baseball like take root when it did? Like not long after it took root in America, when like Japan was adopting a bunch of other things that were primarily European, like a parliamentary system, and I don't know, it was just
on the wrong side of the road.
Yeah, that. But baseball, I don't know if it was just an accident of history or if there was. I'm sure different scholars have different takes on this. The like team sport, like Bill Kelly is the one to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I've read what Bill has written and what Bob Whiting has said, and I mean, I've heard a number of things that people have said. Obviously, I'm not a historian, but it seems like there's one sort of a like cultural affinity argument where you've got the team game, but then there's the one-on-one battle, which is like sumo. It is, both of those things are kind of palatable to the Japanese psyche. I don't know. I'm not really that persuaded by that argument. I think for me, when the Japanese beat the Yokohama team of Americans and that made national news, that seems to me to be a real important moment in Japanese history, because then it's like, okay, similar to Ichiro being the first position or Nomo being the first pitcher to go over, Ichiro being the first position player, Matsuda being the first power hitter and all that. It's this sort of validation like, hey, we can all do this. Our people of our race are able to play this particular sport really well. Let's do it. Let's keep putting our energy and attention into it. Um, and that's why I called the book about basketball Shooting for the Stars, because yes, Hachimura is a star, but again, he's not perceived to be fully Japanese, and so he's there. The country is still shooting for, the Japanese star, and so, you know, and
Is there a guy on the NBA right now, Aaron? Wasn't there that guy? Is that who you were talking about before?
There's been a few that have made it, but not
But
to
like
the
right
level of
now.
celebrity.
There's someone this season who was playing.
There's been a few guys who've been, good. Like Watanabe, who I mentioned earlier. I think he's a really good player. He's just not risen to that level of like, 20 points a game, a matchup nightmare, as they say. He's a good role player in the NBA. And I think he might actually be back in the B League now in Japan. But so I don't know. I mean, to me, I can't get away from the idea that this is all tied to nationalism. That's where I really want you guys to tell me if I'm right or wrong, because that's just my interpretation, and I don't know. I wish it was not that simple, but it feels that way to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think nationalism is like hard and fast. I mean, you're going to see that in any sporting activity, and I think that's the fuel for the Olympics.
Yeah.
It's the whole reason it was created was to celebrate nationalism and to kind of promote it in a kind of environment where then it's also like we're also appreciating that we are all here. But so I mean, I have no doubt in some ways that nationalism is really at a key factor there. What I would wonder, and this is what I haven't looked into this, right? But like thinking about kind of sports stars and sports celebrity, one of the things that always intrigued me, and that this is what I really enjoyed about when I did my first book.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, I did a little bit of this with the more recent book on the Paralympics and some of their athletes. But this idea that athletes are always kind of multifaceted, right? The image that's created of them that is produced by society is multifaceted. So the dominant element is often going to be this national thing. Like Robin was saying about Hitomi Kinoe, right? The fact that she won the medal as a Japanese was the most important thing. That the flag was flying in Amsterdam, right? That was the most important thing. But then you look at you shift that context just a little bit, and you see these athletes, how they're being talked about in Japan. That it is so there are certain conversations where it matters more that, well, she's being compared to men, and so then the gender comes in, and she's being compared to other women. And then you look at Gushi Ken, and he's being compared to other Japanese, and he's being compared to baseball players. And so I think that the question that I would have, I guess, is what are the other pieces of the puzzle, the intersectional elements, right? Because obviously the Japaneseness versus, not fully Japanese is one of the questions. Like, is there a class element here? Is there a regional element? Because Japan, we tend to think of it as very unified, but the reality is it's not. I mean, Osaka has a very different vibe than Hokkaido. And I had to actually look up where Otani was from. I was like, where is he from? I was thinking he was from Hokkaido because that's where he played baseball. Right? Yeah, he's from Iwate, and and he actually I don't think he ever played in Koshien.
Well, I saw him play early, and I was in Sapporo doing a project on the 1972 Winter Olympics, and I heard about this guy that everyone was talking about, and he played for the Sapporo Ham Fighters.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I saw him. It was a long time ago.
Well, wait a minute. Let's not, Robin. Let's not forget. Isn't it the Nippon Ham Fighters?
Sorry,
right?
Sorry, you're right. Nippon.
Credit to our corporate sponsors of this podcast.
Yeah, the Nippon Ham Fighters.
I mean, that's got to be the funniest corporate sponsorship, right? The ham company. I don't know.
That is who he played for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but I think that regional, so that's what the question that I would have is I think the nationalism piece is absolutely going to be central, but what are those other multifaceted pieces when you're looking at a player like that they start coming into play? Yeah.
Would it be your hypothesis though, similar to what Robin said earlier, like, with gender sort of not being paramount relative to nationalism? I mean, I would think that the regionalism is important, but again, I just think it kind of ceases to be that important when somebody from Iwate and somebody from Osaka or Hokkaido, they get together in a bar and they're like, "Hey, did you see Otani play? He's Japanese." Not
Yeah.
he's you know what I mean? I don't know, but that would be my hunch.
Well, and I think that's the case of where they're playing, right? If they're playing at home, if Otani's playing in with the Ham Fighters, Nippon Ham Fighters up in Sapporo, then it's like the local identity is what matters most, right?
Mhm.
But then if he's playing overseas against the Americans, and this is where it kind of you have these different kind of star systems, right? Where the stars are being compared to different people or different athletes. And depending on who they're being compared to, then the value, the thing that's most valuable in that comparison is going to shift. Um, so that's maybe the question that I guess what I would be really interested to kind of dig into. And like I said, I haven't looked into these particular basketball stars, but it wouldn't surprise me to see that there's probably the nationalism is key, especially internationally. But what are people saying back home, right? And if you look at their earlier history, what was kind of significant, like as they were emerging stars?
Definitely. And I'm curious to pick your guys' brain too about some of this stuff in other sports. I mean, I don't want to talk too much about baseball, but what are some other things that it speaks to this conversation speaks to you in other sports? Have you noticed any of this issue of frozen space and you know the regionalism? Any of these topics come up for you in the other work you've been doing?
Well, sort of not exactly answering your question, but just since we've spoken about Hitomi Kinoue, like I think once she returned from Amsterdam, she was like scrutinized a lot, and she had a lot of negative, once the medal was tucked away in the record books, yeah, she was criticized because she was so big and masculine looking.
Hmm.
And like there was a made for TV movie. There was a series that later came about that she was in that was like recent, but like I don't know, a couple decades ago, there was a made for TV movie that I watched that suggested that she was so depressed by all the negative press about her that she kind of became alcoholic, and that directly sort of led to her very early death at like 24. I don't know. I don't know if that's true at all, or even if I misunderstood it. But there was certainly like depression because, and I will say I have seen the actual primary sources, like the Japanese media, that really did not paint her in a nice light. Pretty bad.
And these were
So,
remarks about her body size in particular.
body size, masculinity, just like, are you turning into a man by doing these sports? Which, to be fair, was not limited to Japan. Like a lot of people around the world thought it was really unsettling when women became too like
Yeah,
masculine.
Babe Didrikson, right? That's the
Right.
muscle mole, right?
Right. And obviously if you look at the present day world, it's like people get really uncomfortable if like women have masculine traits. It's like kind of remarkable how much this is still in the discussion, that just like the scrutiny over like the bodies of athletes,
Particularly female athletes.
particularly female athletes. Yeah. So it's just like a little added point about, nationalism and gender. And like, once you're back in the home country, it's like suddenly the nationalism is not important, and it's maybe some other factors. And I think just because some of these mixed race athletes are praised for their athletic ability, it also, like I said earlier, doesn't mean ignorance or racism or xenophobia, etc., cease to exist in Japan. But I do think it did. I think Naomi Osaka's case is really interesting. Like, I'm not really a tennis expert, although I did happen to, we randomly got tickets when we went to see the Paris Olympics, and I was very lucky to get to see Naomi Osaka play. But I think she actually like kind of changed her citizenship, right? Like she was born in Japan to a Japanese mother and Haitian father, but I think she had U.S. citizenship until she gave it up. Because you cannot be a dual citizen after 22, I think, in Japan. Is that correct?
That sounds like something I've read before. I don't know for sure if that's true, but I agree that she's a fascinating case, and I actually think that what she's done has been more inspiring to my students than anything Hachimura has done.
Oh, really?
Not to compare them unnecessarily. I mean, maybe it's an unfair comparison, but so many of my students in my classes, when they write papers on, in sports sociology type classes or in the sport and racism classes that I teach, they're really fascinated by this question of the relationship between societal structure and the individual in terms of mental health, right? These are all college kids who
yeah.
are facing a
Mm-hmm.
terrible job market, and they're worried themselves about a lot of different things. And so the fact that Osaka came out and was very public about her own mental health struggles, they are very inspired by her. And so it's interesting. I think, we started the conversation talking about Otani and how a lot of people are writing papers for you, Dennis, about Otani. And I'm curious, like, are either of you seeing anything about how some of these athletes, when they've been anointed stars, given that, crown by the media, what they're doing with it? Because Otani, I mean, he's a great, great player, but I haven't seen him do something that's sort of transformative for humanity. And not to say that we should expect that out of all our athletes, but I think that's one reason why I've been so fascinated by sports for so long is you have athletes like Jackie Robinson and Billie Jean King, and like these athletes changed the world, and Otani has done that on the playing field. But I think what Osaka's done, Naomi Osaka, I think is perhaps even more impressive, depending on your
I
perspective.
just sent a link. I'm not sure if this is what you're referring to or if this is separate from what you're talking about. But Naomi Osaka started.
The Play Academy.
Yeah, you know about this?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's pretty fascinating. And it's like it's so connected to her because it's like Japan and Haiti and America.
But even if she hadn't done this particular project, just the fact that she was brave enough to be vulnerable publicly is such an inspiration to my students. It's been eye-opening for me.
Well, and I imagine even more so in Japan, where I don't know that mental health is even
That's right.
I feel now like in America it's fairly openly discussed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I just saw an article, that was probably like 3 weeks ago now, maybe something like that. But there was an article that was about how Otani is being picked up in like school circles as a role model, and featured in like, different texts for classrooms and things like that. And part of what the article was making the point about was that, there's been a problem with a whole bunch of celebrities in Japan right now, or recently, right? Not their sports celebrities necessarily, but like there's been all these scandals around celebrity. And so they're kind of like, we're looking for role models that are positive, which I found really interesting because there was also the scandal around his translator and the gambling.
Right.
And that's not even a year old, right? And like that kind of is already gone.
But what would happen, Dennis? I mean, not to give this conspiracy theory any fuel that it doesn't need, but what would happen if tomorrow, somebody like Bob Whiting came out with a story saying, actually, all along it was Otani gambling, just like Michael Jordan used to be a gambler, and his interpreter was the fall guy. I mean,
I don't know. I think it would be devastating.
It would be devastating, not just for Otani, but devastating for Japanese people.
For Japanese people, it'd be devastating for MLB, right?
Absolutely.
Because they've invested a lot of money in him and like this image as well. So, so I think there's this tendency to put, that sports stars are kind of set up on a pedestal, and this is not shocking to any of us, right? This happens not just unique to Japan. But I do think that part of that is part of this kind of general image construction of celebrities in general. that you see, that they're being kind of constantly kind of recreated and invented.
Yes.
And so as that happens, like as more and more information becomes available, right, it opens up again to come back to that multifaceted element, right? There's more potential to kind of explore different facets to them. And so the more famous they become, the more potential like for a problem to arise. And this is something when you start looking back at like early sports stars in Japan, it's there too. Um, and one of the other articles that this whole discussion made me think about was I was seeing something. This was a couple weeks ago as well. That there was and I shared it with my class, an article about a person who is helping athletes, particularly female athletes, with makeup, and they should feel like it's okay to wear makeup.
Hmm.
In Japan, or
in Japan, this was about Japanese athletes because I guess there was an athlete that was criticized for wearing makeup or putting on makeup, and then was criticized for this in like the media sphere, and the online new media, and I was like, okay, that's not what I was expecting to hear, right? That so like this idea that they were paying too much attention to their appearance, and this person was like has a business that is designed to help athletes pay attention to their physical appearance. um and this I was kind of that's the exact opposite of what I would
Oh,
have anticipated. So
surprised me in the way that the media works today, though, right? Like
yeah.
just with how it's all social media, it's all kind of curated. Like,
Yeah.
well, that's actually, yeah, the connection broke up a little bit for me, and maybe we just lost Robin, but that's actually a question I have for both of you is like, do you think that that particular technological change in the last 20 years, social media particularly, has changed the way that people become celebrities in the sports world, but also um, how they're treated as athletes because of their celebrity?
it's interesting. The first time I really thought about this was when Dennis, I don't know if you probably do remember because we were treated very nicely when the Nippon Foundation invited us to that
Yeah.
conference. And for some reason after that, they asked me to write an article about disability sport for American women, which is just like so not what I write about, neither disability sport nor America, but I agreed to do it as an interesting project. And one of the most interesting things, I probably discussed this with you at the time, like it was really, really hard to find any information about
Mhm.
American women who compete, at the Paralympics, like these elite athletes. But the place that I found the most information was really social media.
Mhm.
And I kind of realized it was like, so, your Otanis and your Naomi Osaka's, like they are covered by traditional media and sports endorsements. And, as it's always been, I do think that there's some element of how you look, especially for women athletes, like impacts your
Mhm.
ability to get deals. But um, some of these, Paralympians, they really take control of their own sort of
Mhm.
outreach. And I was impressed, and I thought it was interesting how they were able to like engage directly with fans, but it was a whole different thing. It's different from traditional media.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a little bit about this in the most recent book on the Paralympics, and because partly what I saw is a trend that this actually emerges right around the time of the Nagano Paralympics of '98, is where you start seeing kind of the idea of like streaming beginning to take off, like video streaming, and because the internet technology was just getting good enough to kind of be able to kind of do a little bit of that, and so the Paralympics in Nagano, because they did not get coverage from the typical, the mainstream media, they started kind of saying, well, we can give coverage of every single event, at least some, by this streaming technology. And so they were doing this in like '98. And so if you start looking, like, actually Japan's kind of at the forefront of that, right? This is like one of the first games where that happens. And the IPC eventually kind of creates their own video channel. They have a YouTube channel essentially, where they show like they have like coverage of different events and things like that. And then NBC, like when they started giving a little bit more coverage to the Paralympics, one of the first places they did it was online streaming. Um, And so it's kind of like a way for some of these big media companies or these to get attention and say like, oh, we are covering it. Look, it's over here. Um, and so, but then the athletes themselves, like there's an interesting dynamic, like you're saying, Robin, where they can control the narrative to a certain extent. By kind of doing this, and they don't have to answer the types of questions that like all the inspiration porn type questions that kind of come out of standard typical mainstream media when they're talking about athletes with disabilities. They can talk about kind of a whole other side that they want to focus on. But at the same time, one of the points that I raised in the book was that what this is doing then is it's essentially creating a new burden for these athletes. And I think this is probably true of many contemporary athletes, right? That you also have to have at least a staff member. And if you can't afford to do that, then you have to do this yourself. You've got to curate this list, and you've got to kind of make sure you're constantly posting enough content to keep your fans interested. And you have to then like worry about the backlash when you say something or do something that you just didn't have to worry about, Yeah, because if a reporter covered you badly, you just had that one reporter to deal with. Now you've got hundreds of potential people to kind of constantly deal with.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's like the onus of branding or professional branding is so much higher, it seems now. And it kind of makes me think of what I know some people deal with in the business world, where they have to demonstrate thought leadership as they get higher and higher up the corporate ladder, right? It's not just about, are you doing your job? It's also about, are you doing your job and showing everybody in the world or the industry that you're in, hey, I know what I'm talking about, because that gives you credibility and it potentially could help you make the next deal that you need to make. Maybe it's not that different than the broader business world in that sense. I don't know.
Business.
What's that?
Yeah, I mean, sports are a business.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's ultimately the question is like, is sport, maybe this is only my question, but I feel like the question is sport the nation's business ultimately? And can we think about it in any other way? Because yes, there's multinational corporations that are making money off all these athletes. But ultimately, what drives so much of this to me is, of course, it's the Nikes and Adidas and these big companies. But if you don't have a national narrative, a nationalistic narrative for why these athletes are important, I'm not sure those MNCs are going to really sign on for these big deals. I don't know. What do you think?
I haven't given this much thought. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have anything smart to add. I just know there's definitely like intersection between capitalism and sport and, ticket sales and popularity. And then it's overlaid with, it's these different points of intersection. Like the nationalism is there, especially when they're competing internationally. But I think it also has a lot to do with like stuff you've written about, Aaron, with like schools and I think Japan has like all the conditions for making it like a sport powerhouse. Like this was really driven home to me when I took a trip several years ago to India, and I saw some people trying to run in New Delhi, and it just was like the pollution was so bad, which it's like in many parts of the world.
Yep.
And even relative to a lot of parts of China, like Japan has really clean air, and really good like climate conditions just for exercise, and they have money. It's a wealthy country, and
it wasn't always that way, as you told me before, Robin. Right?
I do know that. I do know that, but right now, it's got all good conditions, and pipelines in many different sports. I mean, I was surprised that, like running along the river, like the Tama River. I saw a lot of people last time I was there playing lacrosse, and I had never seen that in Japan before. And I kept seeing people like carrying lacrosse sticks and playing lacrosse.
Yeah, I never saw that either when I lived there. That's interesting.
Yeah, maybe I was just in a neighborhood where they had like some lacrosse clubs, but and I've seen American football played a couple times in Japan. So I feel like they have the they have a lot of conditions for like being exemplary at almost any sport. But yeah, obviously they've like channeled resources into some, and that is, there's like money is a big
Anna?
factor, I guess, is kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I guess I'm kind of, and this is something I wish I had had more time to kind of dig into, in the research I did on the Paralympics, because one of the things that surprised me the most as I was doing the research was that there are all these little like really interesting pockets, in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find them, of people who kind of, and it often seems to be like you have like somebody who discovers an interest in some particular sport, and like often like in an adapted sports world, it often is like, it's a specific sport like tennis, or it's running, or it's, wheelchair basketball. But that there's these pockets all over Japan. And to a certain extent, like what I've discovered is that exists in the United States too, right? And in fact, what is the United States is much more pocketed, I think, and that you don't have those kind of like centralizing structures that you do in Japan, that have emerged really as a result of the Paralympics. So this is when it became the nation's business. That's where those pockets suddenly started to kind of get connected. Then, we got to get ready for this big international event. So it becomes the nation's business. So we connect those pockets, but those pockets, they continue to exist. They existed before, and they continue to exist when the national attention just kind of dissipates. And I it just randomly, I talked to one of the guys who works with the USTA strength and conditioning program. He works with some of the wheelchair athletes down in Florida, and I think he works with the able-bodied athletes as well. But like just randomly, I was talking with him and kind of shared that had been working on this project in Japan, and he's like, "Oh, my dad actually was really involved in like wheelchair sports in the local community, and like it was just something he started up of his own kind of initiative."
In Japan.
And it's in Japan. And so and that's not the first time I've heard that, right, from people. They're like, "Oh, this so and so in like Nagano, there was like this random really good wheelchair basketball club that is started by somebody up there." And so you have all these really like, and I don't know like how to kind of fully explain that, right, without kind of, because it really requires the type of work that you're doing, Aaron, right, the kind of on the ground, going into these communities and like, how did this community get built? How does it operate? What are because it doesn't have the same, it's not the schools, right? So it's a different set of kind of networks. A lot of times it's around rehabilitation centers, but not always. And that's the interesting point, right? Like you can see why it would be at a rehabilitation center for adapted sports, but when it's not, like, how does that happen? So yeah, I think, but it is kind of what struck me as we were talking is once it becomes the national, then all those get connected, but then they still stay. And that's kind of an interesting dynamic too, that I wish, like I said, I wish maybe one of these days I can get back and do some more with that.
Yeah, that's really an interesting question, Dennis, to think about, right? Like, how do those networks persist afterwards? Because obviously the regional sort of nodes of the network do, but is there still some kind of hub in that network, or does there need to be? Is it more of a diffuse network afterwards? That's a good, really interesting question. Thank you, Guy. I know it's later where you are even than where I am, and Friday afternoon, Friday evening, hard time to make time
No,
for.
it's really good to catch up, and good luck
Yeah.
in your next chapter, Aaron.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah, this
yeah.
has been a nice, I appreciate you bringing that up, Rob, because it's been a really nice way to kind of, put a bow on things for me and get to see you guys and
Don't be a stranger. You're always
thank
welcome.
you. Yeah, and don't forget my friend and writing partner Atsushi Nakazawa and I have a new book coming out this summer on youth sports. We're really trying to change the culture of youth sports in Japan. We're calling it a manifesto. So
Awesome.
please tell your friends that care about Japanese sports and Japanese youth about that. So thank you guys
Sounds
so
great,
much.
Aaron.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys, and we'll talk soon.
Guys,
Okay.
have a great weekend.
You
Enjoy.
did the same. Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye.